So something we are seeing as well from the technology perspective, I go back to the point that Brian was making.
You know, I would just assume that high tech, being what it is, being technologically savvy about everything, would be right out there in front of the curve in terms of AI, artificial intelligence, and machine learning. I mean, Brian, is that your experience, or am I overestimating their capabilities in that area?
Well, I think that this is one of those things that in general everybody assumes that everybody else is doing it. And everybody's talking about it, but nobody really knows what it means. AI is 5 miles wide and 5 miles deep. So coming to some certain operational definitions so that people understand precisely what we're talking about when we talk about AI. I think that the general IQ of community at large is really kind of increasing around AI because your grandmother now has a voice assistant on her coffee table, right? She can ask Alexa to order just about anything for us. And that's representative of the fact that this technology is getting very pervasive. Industry in general, however, I would say there are pockets of best practice, but it is very, very variable right now. And you know, in our business, it's the same way. We're really trying to get out in front of it and leverage the capabilities before everybody else so that we really take the lead.
Yeah. What about on the technology side, you guys?
So a couple of observations from my perspective is that sometimes I hear AI/ML, right? People talk about artificial intelligence and machine learning in the same breath. So just to get grounded in terms of what these mean, artificial intelligence started with the noble ambition of let's take the human brain, have a machine mimic how the human brain thinks and behaves, right?
Yeah.
And somewhere along the line, I guess the community kind of took two paths. One being this purist artificial intelligence kind of path, which is let's try to mimic the human brain. And then the other part of the community went down the path of let's pick some application-specific intelligence as opposed to this generalized artificial intelligence, right? So I think mostly what I'm seeing when it comes to supply chain planning today is more of this application-specific uses of artificial intelligence as opposed to let's replace our planners with machines, right?
Yeah.
So that I'm not seeing. It's more of let's take some specific use cases and let's take some practical use cases and see how machine learning and artificial intelligence applies. Machine learning, frankly, is just that path of application-specific artificial intelligence where you're feeding more and more data within a specific scope to the machine and letting it do certain things very well.
Yeah. But I think that concept of narrow AI versus general AI, I mean, for those of us that grew up in the HAL generation, right, that's sort of probably the misconception that we have at this point. Yeah. And to your point, if we look at where it's happening now, it's those very specific use cases, sure, right? And so the way that I see it from a consulting perspective is that a lot of it is around that supply chain illumination, right? So it's identification of underlying trends that may or may not be as obvious, and then helping the practitioner understand what the causal relationship of those trends are. And so that's where we're seeing in the near term. Sure. You know, I do think as you start to extend that and say, okay, where do you go and how do you augment that narrow AI? What we're seeing in sort of the near term, and to your point about where is the hype versus the reality, you know, for us the next step is starting to combine AI, machine learning, with that human expert in a process, right? And it's that combination of human expertise plus tools and capabilities in a robust process that are really going to drive differentiated outcomes. You know, you did mention the humanless sort of planning. From a Deloitte perspective, you know, we are looking towards the future, and there's a debate in our firm, right? And obviously the further out, like any forecast, the further out, the less precise it is, right? Yeah. But that debate is, will you ever get to the point where you do have humanless planning, or will you always be able to have that combined ecosystem of expert, computer, and process outperform that computer?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it sounds like it's almost a more modest outlook. I mean, we're not, the kind of artificial intelligence that you guys are talking about isn't the kind that, you know, can a machine write a poem? Can a machine write a song or a novel? It's like, can a machine do these trench-like, you know, applications in supply chain? That's another universe. It sounds like a little bit easier to get your arms around when you scale it down to those challenges, right? That's but right. Even that, we're not even close to that though yet, are we?
Well, I mean, but we are in some instances, right? I mean, I think that we are. If you are, I think your description of modesty is right. right? If you say, hey, can we have tools that can identify trends, whether it's a trend in inventory optimization, whether it's a trend in supplier performance, that maybe in the past has been hard to do, like we can do that today. And we are seeing those initial steps of clients moving in that direction. So.
And just to add to that, in terms of supply chain decisions, how the planners make their decisions, oftentimes they work with imperfect data. Oftentimes they work with data with lots of holes in it. That's when where the machine creativity, machine intelligence kind of stops and the human creativity needs to come into picture. So unless you can very tightly scope out an entire end-to-end supply chain planning problem with 100% perfect data, I don't think you can take humans out of the equation, especially with the data the way it is today and what it is rendered.
Well, Brian's still with us.
Yeah,
Schneider.
We're
not going anywhere soon.
Yeah, my perspective is, kind of to go back to the discussion that we had yesterday when I was on stage here. I think that you're exactly right. Humans will have a part in this for a long time, specifically in ETL, but that's drudgery. So things like RPA, the robotic process automation, that's something, we have so many people that their primary role is focused in large part pulling data, aligning data, cleaning data, just by virtue of the fact that we continue to grow through acquisition and not everything's in the same place. They're not all called the same things. We're looking for ways to apply these non-traditional concepts of AI. AI is a very large field, but to your point about, the creativity portion of it, we're evaluating all phases of AI, even ones that you would consider to be way out on the edge and not specifically business applicable, because those are the places sometimes you really find inspiration and a solution that has never been thought of or actually tested before.
So maybe you are thinking about creating a machine that actually thinks like a human.
Oh, absolutely. So learning through observation is basically where the maturity of these technologies is today. So you have to give it the opportunity to understand your business and the difference between good and bad, the different outcomes. And then from there, it's oversight. So you use it to make recommendations, and a human still has to say, okay, do this, or not necessarily to do something. But I think that we're on a very long path right now, and I think that it's let's say short-sighted and not so good for your business if you don't really keep a very broad mind.
Yeah, you mentioned pattern recognition, the very essence of the human mind. Right. That's what our brains do. They recognize patterns. So
connect the dots, right?
Exactly. So we're getting machines that are going to be able to connect the dots at some point.
But I think Brian made a really important point, right? So you're using RPA. It's a tool the capability that's well entrenched in the marketplace. We're seeing it everywhere, right? So I think of AI and machine learning as sort of kind of the second or third generation of that, right? But what I heard you describe is you're looking for wins. You're getting started. You're starting where you can, right? And I think that's probably the important piece for us is define a narrow use case, right? Pull a data set around it, maybe not the entire supply chain. You don't have to have a digital twin of your supply chain in order to make this stuff work. But then start small, right? And celebrate those wins along the way.
Absolutely. Bimodal approach to this for us is key. One, you have to take it from science fiction to science fact, and the easiest way to do that is in your environment with your data using business problems that your leadership can understand. But at the same time, that R&D component, we're really working very hard to understand those longer reaching capabilities too.
Yeah. So something we are seeing as well from a technology perspective, I go back to the point that Brian was making around take the humans from the drudgery, relieve them of that, right? If you look at the planning communities today, a lot of time is spent on just preparing the data, generating the base plan. Forget about what if I do this, what if I do that, doing scenario planning and all that. But technology has evolved to a point where now an end-to-end supply chain plan can be generated very concurrently, looking at your capacities, looking at your materials that is available, looking at your downstream demands and all that. Where do humans go in that world, right? Where that planning process is automated. Does that mean the humans' jobs get eliminated? Not really. That's where the humans bring in the art of supply chain planning, right? Which the machines probably don't understand the full context of, right? That's where the human art comes into play.
So, that's a really interesting point. And as we think about it from a talent perspective as well, the question is, what does the supply chain organization of the future look like, right? And so we're starting to see a transition to, what I think of as the supply chain executive, right? And this is a person that understands supply chain but can explain those challenges in a broader business context, right? It's actually been a challenge for supply chain for a long time. The next piece is you've got to have the data scientists. These are the people that can understand the business problem and then the surrounding data sets that may inform. Right, and then you've got to have the people to actually do the coding and the mathematicians and scientists to make it happen. So, I think that starts to become a very different organization than we have today, to the point that's been made. The drudgery is going to be replaced with RPA. And that's going to create some challenges in the near term for organizations as they make that transition.
Of course, that raises the question of whether, in fact, we do have those people in the pipeline. We talk constantly about a supply chain talent gap in so many areas, especially when it comes to analytical capabilities and technological capabilities. So, what do you guys think? I mean, are the people out there, or do we need to start training them now? How should we prepare for this?
I'll share my perspective, and then Brian, you could probably add from your experience of working with data scientists. Couple of things I would say. Just last week I met with a young man who's just coming out of school, and he's doing a dual track MBA and data science, double masters, right? He asked me, what do you think? Is this a right way to go? I said, absolutely.
Yeah, it's like, I want that guy.
Because the world is moving towards, the division of labor was very clear until now. There are business people and then there are IT people. Now IT is becoming the business, right? Mm-hmm. So that's where this convergence of these technical, strong analytical skills and bringing in the business acumen becomes very important. Like, I was talking to one of the industry analysts who said future of demand planner in future is not going to be a demand planner, it's going to be a commercial troubleshooter. Right?
Interesting.
When the demand doesn't materialize or when you get an unexpected demand, what do? You don't throw it over the fence to supply planners anymore. You become a troubleshooter at that point in time, right? Because you have the business context. Now you're pulling in the broader organization to drive towards how to maximize the opportunity there.
But you have Hal over your shoulder telling you what to do, right? Or do you not? I mean, again, it's what is the person doing here?
Well, the challenge there with that particular concept is that, that assumes that the business models are going to stay the same. And I think that, we can teach the AI. The AI, you have to think about it from the perspective of a 5-year-old. The concept of an ontology, the worldview of the AI is based on all the data that you've exposed it to. So, for example, if you think about the self-driving cars like Google's self-driving car, if tomorrow all of a sudden the FAA decides that flying cars is a good thing, just because we've got AI that understands how to handle itself on the road, which they don't really yet, we'll be able to transition that skill set into the air. There's a very large gap there. But from the talent perspective, I think that these people exist, but we may not be looking in the right places. So I think that the technology skills are much easier to teach than the hard-won, hard-earned supply chain experiences. And the people that I'm really looking for is obviously the technical acumen is really important. But beyond that, I want generalists. I want people who have done many things, that know more and more about many topics and are less specialized in specific areas, because that allows them to create context and connect things with affinity to one another.
So that's a really interesting point, though, because from a consulting perspective, we're actually seeing a drive in the opposite direction, right? Which is increasing specialization, and then the way that we bring that perspective is through a team, right? And I think that you can emulate that within a business context as well. But to answer your question, I'm optimistic about sort of the future of our talent, because I think that we're starting to see more and more broad breadth supply chain practitioners come down the pike. When I was early in my consulting career, though, the reality is it takes 10 years to create a good supply chain practitioner, right? And so what we found,
because they were not teaching it in schools.
No,
right?
well, but they are now. They are now.
They are.
So I think you're seeing more and more recognition of that. But I would also emphasize the point that one of the challenges that we've seen is providing a home for those people that you find today. Right, and we see that organizations consistently mess this up. And you've got this young, bright, dual master's degree kid that's coming out of school, and he's just been exposed to the leading, bleeding edge in university, and then he comes into the stodgy world of corporate America, and they're disillusioned, right? And we're losing talent to these smaller startup firms that are able to provide this more dynamic environment. So, for us, it's about identifying and acquiring the talent, but then creating a home and a career path for those people within our respective organizations. organizations.
Yeah, retention is a challenge for sure, and it's hard to be prescriptive for career paths in this particular field because it's changing all the time. How do you really know, beyond the technical acumen, what are those other things that are going to make the rock star versus just the generic professional?
I think the answer is you don't. I mean, we can't imagine. 10 years ago, we couldn't imagine where we are today. We wouldn't have been just talking about a lot of these things. And 10 years from now, the subject will be completely different. So it is sort of, you have to create people who are just adaptable enough to take on whatever. So there's this magic, okay, we got one double major. I hope there's more, right?
But I also, so building on that, I think about sort of, we work with organizations that are going through different phases of their business development, right? And so you need fundamentally different people in a different executive mindset when an organization's going through an inflection point versus when the business is operating in a stable environment. And as collective supply chain sort of industry or function within a number of industries, we're going through a rapid change. And I think that the executive perspective that I would put out there is that we need perhaps fundamentally different people. We need to give them an environment to grow, to fail forward, and to consistently continue to develop themselves. So our view and our expectations of our practitioner performance may be different in this period of turbulence than it would be in a more steady state environment that we've seen over the last 10, 15, 30 years.
Well, let me bring this full circle, the question I was asking at the beginning, and that is the high-tech industry specifically. Where is it in terms of all we've been talking about vis-a-vis other verticals? Are you guys on the cutting edge? Are you ahead, behind? What do you think?
I'd like to think we're out in front.
Yeah.
But again, it's one of those things that I think that there's a lot of companies that are doing things that they're not communicating about. And the places that I look as far as canary in a coal mine, as far as whether or not we're at the front or the back, is participation in certain types of groups. So for example, like the Apache Foundation, when we talk about blockchain, I look to see who attends those calls, who's going to the conferences, and in that particular field, just like AI, I'm seeing a lot of representation specifically from Silicon Valley and from Ivy League institutions, but heavy industrial just hasn't woken up to this yet. So I feel pretty comfortable that we're pretty far out in front, and we're going to strive to maintain that lead.
Do you think it's because so much of high tech involves outsourced manufacturing and they're working on such low margins and they're just doing what they have to do on a day-to-day basis? No one has time to sit down and take a long view of things, right?
No, I think it's because they have a different viewpoint as far as the evolution of markets. When you consider the fact that companies are falling off of the Fortune 50 almost as fast as they're actually being minted, these guys are not willing to sit there and wait, and they're also not mystified, or they don't view these technologies as arcane. They know it's a guy behind a keyboard doing complicated math at unprecedented scale, and they're not afraid to go after it.
Yeah. So bringing it to demand planning. Your universe, do you think that the high-tech clients that you have, do you think they're very sophisticated and they know where things are going and they're willing to have a forward view of things?
Few select ones, absolutely, because one thing that's happening from demand planning perspective is that the world is changing too fast, and as the product life cycles shrink, especially you get into consumer electronics and these kind of spaces, what's happening is relying on a 3-year-old history to project what the future is going to look like. That's becoming less and less reliable as a technique, right? They want to tune into more and more of the external data sources, capture trends as they're happening and evolving, and be able to shape their demand based on that. But demand planning is one thing, but more importantly is how agile, how flexible is your organization in terms of responding to those demand signals as they come in. You absolutely cannot underplay that. I think some of the high-tech companies that we are working with absolutely are much further on the maturity curve in terms of being able to very quickly posture their inventories and their strategies in general across the supply chain to be able to respond in real time is a reality now with the technology.
Well, I'm glad we settled all those questions. So it does sound like high-tech is really going in a good direction, and your clients are coming to you and asking for help, and you're able to give them some guidance, even though it's hard. That light in the distance is very, very, very faint.
We'll help them along the way.
Yeah, well, great. It's good to know that. Makes me feel a little better about things. Thanks.